Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am Rémi Laurin, Global LoRaWAN Networks Director at Semtech. In the LoRa Alliance, I chair the operator community as well as the EMEA region work group. I am pleased to open the second destination LoRaWAN on roaming. Today, we will move to a more comprehensive discussion on implementing and deploying LoRaWAN roaming. Let me introduce you to an host speaker, Alper Yegin. Alper is probably one of the most knowledgeable persons on LoRaWAN roaming. Alper Yegin has been actively contributing and leading development of Internet and telecom standard for the past 20 years in various forums, including EETF, 3GPP, ETSI, and Zigbee Alliance. For the past 10 years, he has been focusing on IoT, in the later half more specifically on LPWAN and LoRaWAN. Alper has been spearheading the LoRaWAN technology and ecosystem development as the vice chair of the board and chair of the technical committee in LoRa Alliance and director of advanced technology development in Activity. Before we begin, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application engagement tools you can use or move or resize if you like. If you have any question during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A engagement tool. A copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the LoRa Alliance resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and your computer speakers or headset are turned on and volume up so you can hear the presenters. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. Some networks call slides to advance more slowly than others. So if the slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 48 hours after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you to attend the webcast. So now let's dig into LoRaWAN roaming. To start with, I would like to make the transition with the previous January 21 destination LoRaWAN on roaming. If you ask me the question why LoRaWAN roaming is so strategic, let me say that any wireless technology requires coverage to support business expansion. Roaming enables LoRaWAN devices to use multi-LoRaWAN network coverage, thus leveraging coverage potential from Earth to space. But LoRaWAN roaming is far beyond this, and it will surely step change the way network providers implement IoT roaming in the coming years. Let me hand over to Alper, who is going to explain why LoRaWAN roaming is so special and how to set it up.
Thank you very much, Rémi, for the great introduction. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here talking about one of the most advanced features of LoRaWAN, namely roaming. In this talk, I will be talking about the use cases and the features of LoRaWAN roaming, and then I'll describe how it works technically, and then I'll go over how to set up roaming in a step-by-step fashion. And finally, I will talk about the current deployments we have across the globe. The very first use case we have is the international coverage extension, which is a very, I would say, traditional use case. Imagine you have a network in country one, either it's your own network or you subscribe to a network, and then you have devices going around in the neighboring countries. Because each country has a distinct network, when your devices are in other countries, you will have to rely on other networks for providing coverage. And that's where such networks set up roaming agreements among them. so that the radio coverage provided by the neighboring networks would appear as an extension to your so-called home network. And this kind of roaming has been present with almost all wireless communication technologies. And obviously, that's where we start from by enabling this basic use case. And then in the subsequent use cases, you'll realize we start to go well beyond this basic case. The second one is, again, we are in a country. Now we have two networks. Neither of them would provide nationwide coverage, but when the two are put together, they can provide a unified nationwide coverage. And by setting up roaming between these two, or even maybe 3 or 4 such networks across the nation, we can achieve a nationwide coverage for the subscribers of either network. Now, in the cellular world, most of the time, operators have nationwide coverage. They rarely roam with the others within the same country. So we already see a little bit of going beyond the traditional roaming here. But then with the next one, you will see that we certainly start setting us apart from legacy and even the new generation, mostly cellular IoT networks. In order to explain the next use case, let me provide a little bit more background on how other technologies work and how LoRaWAN works in terms of the radio networks providing connectivity service to the IoT devices. With the urban IoT, LTE-M, and even 5G and also Wi-Fi, there is a concept called attachment. The end device would attach to a base station or an access point. Depending on which technology you use, the terminology is a little bit different, but there's this attachment procedure. And after that point on, all the traffic transmitted by the device, like the sensor in this case, would only be served by that single base station or single access point that serves the end device. Even though there might be several other base stations within the coverage of this sensor, they would not be really listening to the frames or the packets transmitted by the sensor, and only one base station would be in charge of providing that service. Given that the nature of RF can change, the radio frequency based communication can change, obviously in an ideal setup, one would like to leverage all the base stations within the coverage in order to receive the frames or the packets from such devices. And that's exactly what we do with LoRaWAN. Unlike in those technologies where there's an attachment with a base station, with the LoRaWAN, actually there's a so-called join procedure, or joining to a network, where the network can have one or more base stations serving the end device. So in this case, this sensor, when transmits a so-called uplink frame, now it can be received or demodulated by all of those 4 base stations, and every one of them would send the copy of the same frame to the typically cloud-based network server, which will deduplicate the frames and then eventually would send a single copy of that frame to the application server. So with the changing RF conditions, the first frame might be received by one gateway, the second one might be received by the other one. Given that we don't really lock in to a base station, any one of those base stations receiving the uplink frame would provide the full connectivity to that device. Now, imagine those base stations belonging to distinct networks. This basically brings us to a case where multiple LoRaWAN networks with overlapping coverage, as in this case, we have the red network and the blue network. And in this case, the red one is the home network and blue one happens to be a visitor network, but they do have a coverage around the same area. Now, with the kind of roaming we have, these two networks can adopt their radio network assets, meaning that both the red base stations and the blue base stations would be simultaneously serving this LoRaWAN device. So in a way, the net effect, looking at it from the end device perspective, is the network is densified. Now it has twice as many base stations as before. So what does this really get us? Well, this kind of network densification, by putting together multiple distinct and standalone networks, it provides us the net effect of bringing the gateways closer to the end device. So if the gateway or if the base station from the home network is not close, but say a base station from the visit network is close, certainly this device would be taking full advantage of the closer base station. And through that proximity, and now another great feature of LoRaWAN kicks in, the so-called adaptive data rate. Now the device can start using higher data rate and also lower its transmission power, because it no longer needs to use a low data rate and high transmission power, which are essential for communicating with a far base stations. So by lowering the transmission power and increasing the data rate, now the transmission from that device would create less interference for the other devices in its vicinity. And it will also elongate the battery lifetime of that device. So this is very much beneficial for both the network and the end device. And then once we have more base stations or more LoRaWAN gateways being able to demodulate uplink frames, now we can, for this, another great feature of LoRaWAN kicks in, the so-called geolocation, where by using time difference of arrival and also received signal strength indicator, we're able to locate the end device without having to resort to a GPS or Wi-Fi fingerprinting or Bluetooth beaconing. So for that feature, 3 or sometimes even 4 LoRaWAN gateways needs to be receiving the same frame. Now, with the ability to add networks together, we increase our chances of having a high number of LoRaWAN gateways receiving the frame, so that we can have a pretty accurate geolocation of such devices using LoRaWAN geolocation feature. Now, as interesting as this feature might sound, please note that this feature is not available to the other LPWAN technologies like Narrowband IoT and Wi-SUN. Due to the technical limitations, they do attach to a single base station at a time, so they don't have this so-called macro diversity effect to take full advantage of such densification. And in case of Sigfox, where there is really a single network in any location, there's no chance of having multiple networks to jointly provide radio connectivity. And this feature is not really limited to only having 2 networks with overlap coverage, but you can have 3, 4, even 5 and more networks with overlap coverage. And that will only make things better. Now the gateways would feel even closer to the end device, and even more gateways will be receiving the same transmission. And if we look at this in a much simpler illustration, this is what you get. Imagine there are 2 nationwide networks, network A and B, and they have overlap coverage. Now, such case in, say, cellular IoT would not be subjected to any kind of roaming, because each network would say we have enough coverage, right? But with LoRaWAN, the 2 would be compelled, or would be, I would say, attracted to set up roaming, because through that, they can have this additive effect towards densification of their networks, which will be beneficial to their own customers, and also it will be beneficial to their own radio resource management. So the next use case we have is where we're able to mix public and private networks. So in the legacy technologies and in other, more specifically cellular IoT technologies, roaming is typically between public networks. Only public networks would set up roaming with the other ones, and usually those are large networks. With LoRaWAN, we have the ability to set up roaming between public and private networks. A specific example we use such a use case is where we have a multinational enterprise network that has assets or devices in multiple countries. And instead of having subscription with the public operator in every one of those countries and having to do proprietary interface-based backend integration, we can enable such a network to have a so-called core-only infrastructure, meaning that no radio network at all, but instead have a roaming-based interconnection with those public networks. And through that, this enterprise network is able to aggregate the traffic coming from its devices in various countries with the help of public operators in those countries and get them all the way to its core network from which it can push the data to the data platforms. Now, the reason we're able to enable such a use case is the infrastructure is pretty low cost with LoRaWAN, such that any enterprise can build its own LoRaWAN core network. In the cellular case, building a core network is an expensive venture, and that's why enterprises would not really make such an investment. But the kind of investment needed on the LoRaWAN end is pretty achievable, and we are already seeing several examples, such enterprise networks coming around and setting up this kind of roaming. Secondly, the interconnection is pretty straightforward. You don't need to be a tier 1 public operator to set things up. Your IT department can easily set up roaming with the other networks. And obviously, the collaborative nature of our ecosystem makes it pretty practical for this kind of roaming be set up among the public operators and the private networks as well. And then obviously with the same token, we can set up private-to-private roaming as well. And here's an example. Imagine there's a car manufacturer and it's working with parts suppliers in various countries. And each one of these locations can have their own private network using gateways that are built to provide connectivity for their own assets. But imagine those parts are being shipped from one part supplier to the car manufacturer, and that shipment, the containers needs to be tracked, like when they leave site 1 and when they enter site 2, would like to have some trackers on them. Now, by setting up roaming between those 3 private networks, such assets can be enjoying the connectivity provided by the gateways in every one of these sites, whereas the data can be aggregated at the proper private network. And again, the low-cost infrastructure, easy interconnection, and the collaborative nature of our technology and the ecosystem play a very important role in this. And the very last case we have is where we are able to interconnect the terrestrial networks with the satellite networks. The long-range ability of LoRaWAN and the high scalability we get out of it makes this technology suitable for hosting LoRaWAN gateways or base stations on LEO, low Earth orbiting satellites, which are flying above ground 500 to 600 kilometers. And such satellite networks provide connectivity in the most remote areas of the world, like the middle of the oceans and the desert and the forests and the mountaintops. Now, through that, any network, whether it's private or public, that may or may not have its own terrestrial coverage, can set up roaming with the satellite providers so that it can enjoy the extended coverage provided by the satellite providers. So we're able to not only deal with roaming on a terrestrial basis, but also we're able to take it to the space and interconnect satellite-based networks with the terrestrial ones. So if we look at the collection of all these use cases, the very first one is the most legacy one, the most straightforward. But as you go down this list, you see we have more and more very advanced use cases. And the reason we have all these advanced cases is to lower the cost of connectivity and also to provide flexibility for the various use cases and the connectivity ecosystem we are nurturing. So now, if you look at how this really works behind the scene, I only have 2 slides. I won't go into too much detail. As you know, a LoRaWAN device has 2 types of procedures. One is the join procedure. That's when the device connects to the network. It goes through a join procedure by sending a join request. And the other one is transmission of regular data traffic, up and down link, right? For the join procedure, when the device sends a join request, it has the device identifier, and this frame also has an identifier of a so-called join server, which is in charge of authenticating the end device and also keeping track of the home network of the end device. When such a join frame is received by a visited network, now this visited network, by inspecting the payload, identifies the join server and then sends a request to the join server to discover the home network of that device. And upon discovering the home network, what it would do is to send this join request all the way to the home network. Now, that's how the home network receives the join request, and the join answer would be traversing the same exact path in the reverse direction from the home network to the visited network to the gateway, serving the device down to the device itself. And now, if we look at how the data is transmitted following the join procedure, by the way, this join procedure happens, I would say very rarely. Once the device joins, it can continue that connectivity session for a pretty extended period of time, like days, weeks, and even months, during which it would be sending its regular data and receiving regular data. As in this case, this end device sending an uplink frame. Now, this frame has a field called device address. And inside that device address, we have a field that identifies who the home network is. So the visited network, by inspecting that portion of the device address, figures out who the home network is, and it would push that uplink frame to the home network. So that's how the end device uplink frame will find its way home. And the reverse direction, the downlink direction, is just the total opposite of this, where the downlink frame is sent from home network to the visited network, down to the gateway and to the end device. Now, this kind of roaming in our own terminology is called passive roaming. The reason is the roaming is totally transparent to the end device. At this point in time, the device doesn't know whether it's under the coverage of a visited network 1 or 2, or if it is still under the coverage of home, or if it is under the coverage of multiple of these networks at the same time. It just keeps transmitting its uplink frames and keeps receiving the downlink frames without having to know its whereabouts. And again, that feature is very advantageous for the end device, because that keeps the end device away from having to do lots of handshakes for discovering networks and for doing synchronization. And then the data path that is set up between the end device and the home network, whether it's going through one visited network or the other, or directly attached to the home, this data path is encrypted and integrity protected between the end device and the home network. So even if this traffic is going through some private networks, some enterprise networks, or some gateways that might be placed outside, that might happen to be physically accessible by the adversaries, that would not create any security issues with the data. If the data is tampered, it will be detected, and the content of the data cannot be read in plain text, because it's encrypted between the end device and the home network. So now let's talk about how one can go about deploying LoRaWAN roaming. So these are 4 simple steps, and I will go and talk about them one by one. And just be aware that whether you are deploying a public network or private network, the steps are just the same. There's no distinction. The first step is, in order to use LoRaWAN roaming, you need to have a roaming capable infrastructure. What that means is, on your network server and join server, you need to be implementing a part of the so-called LoRaWAN backend interfaces spec. And the part that you need to be implementing is the so-called stateless passive roaming. The version of that spec that has been implemented in the ecosystem and deployed is the version 1.0. Well, recently, around two months ago, we have published a new version of this specification that comes with the support for geolocation, even for roaming devices. Right now, the industry is working on implementing this version of the spec. So you can, I would say, expect to see deployments using that spec in the coming 4 to 6 months. And that's what you need to implement. And on the end device, all it needs to implement is the LoRaWAN link layer spec. And any version of the link layer spec can be used for passive roaming. Like I said, the roaming is totally transparent to the end device. It just sends uplinks as usual and consumes downlink as usual. As such, it's not really a part of the roaming procedure that happens among the network infrastructure elements like the visited network server, home network server, and the join server. And as long as the end device is operating under the same RF region, like say EU 868, there's really nothing the device needs to do. Obviously, if the device were to cross the border from, say, EU region to US region, or the Asian regions, or the South Korean region, because the regulations are different, the device needs to be aware of this change of location, and it'll need to use a different regional parameter set. But that is independent of the roaming it's enjoying, which is handled behind the scene by the network elements. So this is first step. And then the next step is, now that you have an infrastructure that is ready for using roaming, then you need to go and get a NetID. NetID is a globally unique identifier assigned by the LoRa Alliance. And this ID is used for the networks to uniquely identify their roaming partners. And also this identifier or a transformation of that NetID is used and embedded inside the device address. Remember, the slide name and the visible network inspects the device address. Embedded inside the device address is the so-called network ID, which gets mapped to the home network. And in order to generate the proper network ID for your own devices, you need to get your globally unique assigned NetID from LoRa Alliance. And to get that assignment, all you need is to become a member of the LoRa Alliance. Any Alliance member, as part of their membership benefit, would enjoy having their own NetID. All they need to do is to send an email to help@loraalliance.org, and they would be assigned their NetID. And there are different types of NetIDs depending on the membership level the member has. There are type 0, type 3, and type 6 NetIDs. The fundamental difference among these types is how many devices they can uniquely identify. Other than that, all these types operate just the same way. You configure it on your network server and you let it assign device addresses using that assigned NetID. Then, now that you have your network server, join server set up, you have your NetID configured, the next thing you need to do is to go find a partner. And for that, I would like to take your attention to a very recent PR that LoRa Alliance had issued, where we have identified 27 countries with roaming-capable public networks. All those green ones you are seeing on this map have at least one public operator that has the capability and the willingness to set up roaming with the other networks. And if you're wondering what those operators might be, here is the list. So depending on which country you would like to have coverage, you can look at this list and identify the operator name and get in touch with them for setting up roaming. And just be aware, this list is what we have as of today, and it's constantly growing. So keep checking with the LoRa Alliance to get to know about the latest and the most comprehensive list. So you see the country names in here. That's where you have the public operators in those countries. And then you also see one operator here that provides connectivity through satellites. And then also another provider here for a roaming hub that facilitates interconnection of networks, which enables a majority of the roaming interconnection in this list. And once you identify a partner, you need to have an agreement. Roaming is a mutual relationship. With your partner, you need to agree whether each one of you would be allowing roaming in devices or roaming out devices. So you can have bidirectional roaming or unidirectional roaming. It's all part of your business case and your needs. And then the roaming partners will also need to agree on whether the accounting will be based on counting frames or counting devices, and the service level agreement, and then the commercial aspects like pricing, which are all taken care of among the roaming partners in bilateral ways. And then once you have the agreements, the next step is an IT job, interconnecting networks. Now, before interconnecting, you want to make sure the network server of both parties can interoperate. Obviously, they need to have implemented the standard backend spec, but even though two vendors have implemented the standard spec, that doesn't mean that their platforms would interoperate from the very beginning, right? Before you roll out to your production network, you want to make sure the network server from both sides can interoperate. Now, if the network servers are coming from the same vendor, obviously interop comes for free. You don't have to worry about it. But if the network servers are coming from two distinct vendors, you would like to ask them if they have done interop in the past for potentially other customers of theirs. If they have done that, then that's good. If they haven't, then you will need to ask these two vendors to carry out interop to make sure their implementation of the backend spec is fully compliant and there are no bugs and any incompatibilities. And then once the interop is achieved, the next is the interconnection, which is basically configuring one network server against the other, so that the traffic is transmitted towards the right endpoint. There's a security association set up, and the flows are opened. Imagine there are firewalls in between. The firewalls should be allowing such flows, things like that. For interconnection, there are two options. One of them is the peer-to-peer interconnect, where the network server of one operator will need to have this interconnect with every one of its roaming partners. And then we have also adopted the well-proven concept of running roaming hubs in our ecosystem, where any new network that wants to set up roaming with the others, if it chooses to go through a roaming hub, there will be only one-time interconnection, and through that, logical interconnections will be set up through this roaming hub. So both options are available for our ecosystem. And a given network could choose one, the other, or they can even mix the two depending on who their roaming partners are. On this slide, I would like to talk about a mistake that we do encounter in the ecosystem. So as I have explained earlier, the device address, one part of that device address signifies who the home network is. And then on the join request side, one part of the request signifies or identifies who the join server is. As such, the way the device address is formed or the join request is formed, a special attention needs to be given how these fields are populated. Meaning that if someone uses a randomly chosen device address, they would obviously have the so-called network ID part being random. And when a device with a random device address happens to be roaming under other networks, those other networks, those visit networks, cannot identify the home network. So your device would be basically lost. Its traffic would never find home. So that means when assigning device address to your devices, you have to make sure you form the device address using the network ID based on the NetID assigned to your network by the LoRa Alliance. You shall not use randomly chosen device addresses. Similarly, the join EUI, and also in the earlier version of our specifications, we have called that app EUI, shall not be a random value. It shall be a value assigned to a join server that is meant to be identified by the visited networks. If you were to use randomly chosen join EUIs in here, that does not point to a real join server. Once again, your devices cannot find home when they try to activate under the coverage of visited networks. And also the value, even if that value is assigned to a join server, that value shall be generated from the so-called IEEE OUI, which is another unique ID, this time assigned by IEEE. So you should not just pick your own join EUI on your own. Instead, you should generate join EUI by using the IEEE assigned organizational unique ID, OUI. So there are all these ID management schemes behind the generation of these values. And we would strongly advise you not to comply with such assignment to make sure your devices can take full advantage of roaming and they don't get lost in the wilderness once they are roaming. So with that, actually, this is my last slide. As you see, we have a very powerful technology and we have a very collaborative ecosystem behind it. So whether you have a private network or a public network, we would like to invite you to build your network and join forces with the others through roaming. And after all, our objective is to enable massive IoT by bringing low cost, low power, and ever-expanding LoRaWAN coverage to all use cases of IoT around the world. With that, I would like to thank you for listening. And now, back to you, Remy.
Thanks, Alper, for this comprehensive and insightful presentation. We will open for Q&A in a moment. But first, I would like to thank our destination LoRaWAN sponsors who helped make this webcast possible. Thank you to MachineQ, a Comcast company, as the destination LoRaWAN Gold sponsor, and our two silver sponsors, Birds and Charter Communication. Thank you to our LoRa Alliance members who participated today. Please take a few moments to learn about the amazing benefits that are available to LoRa Alliance members by viewing the membership benefits document under the resources section. The LoRa Alliance drives the future of LoRaWAN, and we want all of you to help shape the future. The LoRa Alliance will be bringing new content nearly every week to Destination LoRaWAN. Please visit the Destination LoRaWAN Engagement Hub and sign up for notifications for upcoming webcasts. If you or a colleague would like to view this webcast again, an on-demand version will be available in approximately 48 hours and can be accessed using the same audience link you used to attend today's webcast. Now, we would like to open it up for Q&A. Thank you.
All right, so let's see. We already have a number of questions coming in. So please continue adding your questions to the Q&A box, and I will start reading and answering from there. Okay, let's see. The first one is from Nick. Nick said, say I'm using a LoRa network of a telecom provider in a country. If I then go to another country where there are only public networks, then the telecom operator needs roaming agreements with all of those public networks, right? Okay, so this is the scenario where you are a subscriber to a network, but your devices are either visiting other countries, other network coverage, or they are permanently roaming in those countries. And you being in need of roaming, given that you are a subscriber to an operator, you would have to rely on that operator setting up roaming with the others where your devices are located. Alternatively, if instead of relying on a public operator to subscribe, if you were running your own network, then you would be responsible for setting up roaming with the other public networks in the other countries. So the first case is a public-to-public roaming case. The second one is a private-to-public roaming case. In that second case, the private network is owned by you, and you would be in charge of setting up roaming. So let me mark this. Okay. All right, so then the next question is from Anna. Starting at which version of LoRaWAN roaming is possible, in particular private, public roaming, and private to private? As I had covered, the end device is not really part of the roaming signaling. The roaming is totally transparent to the end device. That's why we call it passive roaming. As such, any version of the link layer spec implemented on the end device can be subjected to roaming. Now, the whole scheme, the roaming scheme, is working on the backend side. So you need to have a network server and working with joint servers that are compliant with the backend interfaces spec. And the very first version of that specification already supports roaming. Okay. The question from Jim is, does LoRaWAN roaming support a roaming consortium model where an operator joins a consortium to get roaming support on all other member networks? Right now, at the moment, the roaming is bilateral. All the networks you see on that list, they do set up their roaming agreements in pairwise fashion. But obviously, as the deployments evolve, we will be adopting such schemes from legacy systems as well, where networks will create consortiums and joining one will open roaming capability with any other network in that consortium. In terms of the standard and the technology and the implementations, such a scheme does not require any extension. It's just a matter of business setup and configuring platforms accordingly. So in a way, all the implementations and the standard spec is already ready for such a case. It's a matter of the market evolving and demanding this be set up in a commercial sense. Okay, this question is from Muralidhar. What is LoRa Alliance role in roaming agreements with operators? Actually, the roaming agreement is a matter among the networks. LoRa Alliance is not a part of that agreement. Typically, it involves a commercial agreement, and it is carried out independently by the LoRaWAN ecosystem players, without the LoRa Alliance being involved. Okay, so this one is from Aurelis from Talkpool. Hi, Alper. Is there a commercial strategy set up? In other words, what does it cost to use another network, or what can we earn opening our network to others? So again, this is a commercial method that is discussed and agreed upon bilaterally among two operators, and it differs from one to the other. There are several factors, one of which is the radio network coverage of the network, the quality of the deployment, the types of SLAs that can be provided, etc. And these are the factors shaping up the commercial elements. But again, there are several other commercial elements, and this is a discussion for you to have with your roaming partner networks, whether they are public networks or private networks. Okay, I'm just managing the questions. Bear with me for a second. Yeah, okay, another question from Amado is very similar. What about billing and costs, fees for roaming between different networks? Again, it's a commercial matter. LoRa Alliance or LoRa Alliance standards do not have anything to say on that. It's left to the market to decide among themselves. Okay, this question is from Yusuf. He is asking, how can we change joint server ID once we deploy the server, or is it possible? So the joint server ID is the so-called joint EUI, or in the earlier version of our specification, it's called FEUI. Now, this value is set on the joint server, and it's also set on the end device. Now, you can change this value, but you would like to make the change in a coordinated way. Let's say you have provisioned this joint UI on a batch of devices, and you have already deployed those devices. Now, if you change this value on the joint server, then you would lose synchronization. So you'll have to make sure the changes on the end device and joint server is synchronized if you choose to change it on the joint server. On the other hand, you may have reasons to change it on the end device. Say you want to migrate the device credentials from one joint server to the other. You can do so by changing the joint UI on the end device. As long as you ensure the credentials are also migrated from legacy joint server to the new one, everything will continue working as before. So just remember, joint UI is a pointer that's set on the end device, pointing to the joint server. So when you're changing it, you have to keep this in mind. But otherwise, yes, you can change this value. Just make sure to coordinate it in your system. Please. Okay, so this question is from Philip. What is the architecture for satellite connection, direct uplink, downlink connection from device to satellite? Yes. So with the new data rate called long-range frequency uplink spread spectrum that comes up with the latest region parameters document, we're able to set direct connection, uplink connection from end devices on the ground with the LEO satellites. LR FHSS is used for uplink only, and downlink, if the deployment is using downlink, and if it is using LoRaWAN, it'll have to be using the LoRa data rates or LoRa modulation. But the uplink for scalability reasons would be LR FHSS. And the scalability reason is these satellites usually have a very big coverage area in the order of hundreds and thousands of kilometers. Given that there will be so many devices within that coverage area uplinking their frames, we have this new data rate to accommodate super high scalability. that can, on one side, provide uplink connectivity through satellites, and also in terms of deep indoor coverage, that also significantly it provides a significant boost to the scalability of deep indoor cases. But the rest of the system, whether the base station is mounted on LEO satellite or on the ground, it's just the same. They just need a backhaul. Obviously, the satellite hovering above sky, its backhaul is also a radio link, which is not using LoRa, but some other satellite connectivity technology to bring the demodulated frames down to the ground. And then those frames are pushed to a network server. And from there on, it's business as usual, interconnecting to the LoRaWAN roaming fabric. Yeah, so Anas is asking, as an adapter member, we have been assigned a Type 6 NetID. Does it mean that we may need to apply for a Type 0 or 3 NetID in order to address more devices? That is true that Type 3 has the largest address base, or larger than Type 3, which is larger than Type 6. As you grow your business, if you feel pressure on the address space, then the option we provide as LoRa Alliance is to upgrade your membership. That will come with a larger address space. And while doing so, be aware that for those devices that are not roaming, you can already use the reserved NetID values 0 and 1, which already comes with 25 bits of address space that can be used by anyone. As long as those devices are not roaming, you can freely use those spaces. But for your roaming devices, in order for them to find a home, you would need to use your dedicated NetID. And the Type 6 NetID has its own space that provides the unique device addresses. And yes, you would need to upgrade your membership to get larger and larger spaces. Okay, and Paolo is asking, if I set up my own LoRaWAN network of devices, do I still need to obtain a NetID? Definitely not. If your devices are not roaming, you do not have to have a dedicated NetID. You can instead use the NetID value 0 or NetID value 1, which is reserved for as a shared NetID that can be used by anyone. Okay, so let's see. Amado is asking, could I reassign a device's ID to the visiting network instead of using roaming? Scenarios like using a second-hand device used in the network before, and definitely to be assigned to a new network forever. Right, so as you might know, we have ABP devices and OTA devices. ABP devices come with a burnt-in device address, and the OTA devices dynamically configure their device address from the network they are attached to or joined. So if you are using an OTA device, obviously the next time the device joins, the network, the new one, can tell the device to change or to get a new device address. Now for your ABP device, you will need to do this manually, but you can do that as well. So if you are buying a second-hand device that happens to be an ABP device, you will need to use some out-of-band mechanism to change its device address through USB port, serial port, or NFC, Bluetooth, etc., whatever interface it provides. And if it is an OTA device, this can be done over the air, over the LoRaWAN join, the device will be performing. But in either case, the quick short answer is yes, you can do that. Your device is not stuck with the address it was configured from or by its previous network server. Okay, so Alexandra has asked a question. So here's how it goes. How do the extra processes affect to the join procedure in terms of time? And later she elaborated. She said, I mean, do the node need to listen to the join accepted from the server for more time than in usual case? Do the extra processes mean any risk for the timeout window? So for the over-the-air activated devices, the OTA devices, the device at the onset sends a join request, and then it awaits a join accept to come in at a predefined time. If it does, and those predefined times are called RX1, RX2 receive windows. If the join accept does not come in time, then it would attempt join again. And the device would keep trying joining by sending join requests until it receives a join accept. Obviously, we have this back-off procedure to make sure the device does not drain its battery trying too hard. And on top of that, device can also have its own application policy to take it easier or to give it a break for a while and then try again like a day or two later. So the join accept, like I said, is expected within a well-defined receive window, and for that the device does not open a continuous reception, and this ability is for retaining the battery or keeping the battery consumption under control. So there is really no opening or listening more than usual case. I'm just referring back to the question. So yeah, I mean, the system is very tightly designed to preserve battery lifetime. So device only opens a very short period of time, listens to the preamble. If there's no preamble, it closes the reception window. If there's a preamble, it keeps listening, and then it checks the join accept. If it is for the end device, it consumes and concludes the join procedure. If not, it goes back to sending the next join again, trying another attempt. I hope that answered the question, Alexandra. If not, please ask again, elaborate. You're more than welcome. Let's see. Frequency restriction. Okay, so this one is from Mauro. Comparing with the regular GSM roaming services, telcos has one agreement, and the use of the extended network is billed and balanced among the telcos involved at the voice or data services. How about the business model for the LoRaWAN roaming service? Do we have any model in place to monetize the services? Right now, there's ongoing work reflecting what Mauro has mentioned in here. Instead of having several roaming agreements and several billing and charging, having like another person that asked this question, could there be a consortium? Yes, there's ongoing work to set up consortiums where there will be a single bill at the end of the month, whereas there might be multiple parties involved in that consortium. Now, whenever applicable, we are importing such features from legacy systems, but given that we are not automatically importing every legacy approach to LoRaWAN roaming. Because for one, we are building a massively scalable system. For that, we're keeping the overhead low, and for that we are keeping everything as simple as possible. And we're only picking and choosing from legacy systems where there's immediate market demand, and also the cost of building that feature the benefit of building that feature justifies the cost. So that's why you would not see every bells and whistles in the legacy systems being reflected onto LoRaWAN roaming from the get-go, but instead we'll be mostly cherry picking and also developing our own native approaches, because some of the features we have, like microdiversity, it doesn't exist in the legacy systems. As such, it does present different benefits and also things we need to deal with, and we do take care of them in our own way. I certainly expect to see what you just described, Mauro, to come up in the coming months. All right, so this is answered as well. Some of the questions are not really, I would say, clear. At the end, I'll come back to them, and then actually, let me ask. So Mohammed has asked a question about overseeing rights and administrative access. I think I would need a bit more clarification on that, Mohammed. If you can repost your question with more clarification, then I'll make an attempt at answering that. Thank you in advance. And similarly, Ismail has asked, in the mass deployment, what kind of network setup do you recommend? I would need a little bit more clarification on that as well, because it's a bit vague for me to answer right now. I will need your help. Yeah, so, okay, Uwe is asking what is the RX delay time window that is recommended for roaming, 4 seconds. So, well, we are working on a document that is about to be published. It's a technical recommendation for operators in Europe for roaming. In that, we are recommending a 5-second delay for the receive window, and that seems like a safe window. But obviously, what you like to do is to consult with your roaming partner in case they have a high latency backhaul. You would need to take this into account. But if things are typical, then a 5-second delay should be fine. Okay. Okay, so Ismail is asking, how can we benefit from satellite gateways? Can we include them in our network? Right, so actually, we're going to have a special webinar by LoRa Alliance in the coming weeks on satellite networks. Please do join that. But until then, here's what I can tell you. There are satellite networks built by satellite service providers, and they are independent, standalone networks, just like the terrestrial ones. So unless you're building your own satellite network, what you would like to do is to set up roaming with such satellite networks. It's just in the very same way as you would set up roaming with the terrestrial ones. You will identify your partner. You might remember there's already one on the slide that I had shown, and then get in touch with them and have an agreement to let your devices roam into their network. And typically, for those satellite networks, the device would have the standard LoRaWAN stack, but it would have a special antenna in order to maximize its chance of getting demodulated by the satellite. So there exist devices that can get some of their messages through even with regular antennas, but in order to increase your success, you would need to have a special antenna. And the rest is your device making its transmissions, and it being demodulated by the LoRa gateway mounted on the satellite, being beamed down to the ground station, going to the satellite provider service station, which feeds it into their so-called forward network server. And if you had set up a roaming with them, that forwarding network server will push that uplink frame to your home network server. And the rest is just as if you have received that uplink through a terrestrial gateway. Okay, any other questions? Okay, it seems like we have done. There's a satellite-specific question. We have any document on communication between device and your satellite? Like I said, as far as we are concerned, they would be using the LRFHSS data rate, which you can find details around that and references in the LoRaWAN regional parameters document. And above that is standard LoRaWAN. This is as far as we can provide within the LoRa Alliance. If you'd like to have more specific details about particular implementations, you would need to get in touch with the specific satellite company. All right, so we have, these are all the questions that that we have to answer now. Like I said, some questions were not specific. If the people who posted those questions would like to elaborate, we have maybe a little less than a few more seconds, let's say, to give you a chance. Otherwise, I would like to thank you for your participation and for your valuable questions. Please stay tuned for the future LoRa Alliance webinars, and we are looking forward to seeing you at the future events. Thank you.